All right, hi everyone. This section is going to cover everyone's favorite topic, which is homicide. Um, we're going to talk about it a bunch of different ways. I'm not going to go over a lot of things that I think are plainly laid out in your book. We'll talk about some different things. Um, First of all, when we want to talk about homicides, the first thing everybody wants to know is how many. And we kind of talked about this a little bit when we looked at the crime rates and you looked at all the homicide rates and things like that. But I just want to reiterate, you hear in the news, crime rates up exponentially, crime rates at an all-time low. And you're like, I don't know what to make of those two things. They can't both be true. They kind of are, depending on what you're looking at and what you're talking about. And this is why you have to be really careful with this type of information. And I say this again, I know we already talked about it because homicide rates are very often portrayed in the media one way or another, especially in like an election cycle to talk about the direction of what's going on in terms of violent crime. And so it's important to be able to pick that apart and kind of get down into the truth. So again, I just put two graphs I pulled up here and I just typed into Google USA homicide rate and hit images, and these are two that popped up that I found. And I think that's how a lot of people get information. So that's why I put them up here. So you see the first one here from the BBC is just showing the rate from 2000 to 2021 here at the end. And then if you look at that, you're like, oh man, we're like not doing good. It's going up. It's going up. And it is, right? A little bit. But again, some context over the past 80 years, 60 to 80 years, you've got a lot of fluctuation. And while, yes, we are going up, we are still, very much lower from where we have been. So just, again, a little context for that. All right. I pull up this data, and if you download the PowerPoint, I put in the notes section the link to the CDC data. You can create your own little charts like this, in all your spare time. But this breaks down by age all of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. And so you can see here, we got less than one, kids, grown-ups, and here's kind of going to be our sweet spot in criminal justice, 15 to 34. That's kind of where we shine, right, in terms of victims and offending. Excuse me, and then on and on. And so you can see unintentional injury has been, it is a leading cause in young people, right? And now I converted this one to rates. They have all kinds of options, but so this is per 100,000 people. When you look at homicides, you see, okay, well, top 10 leading cause of death for people 1 to 54. We should probably pay attention to that, right? And again, I know we talked about the rates sitting around 5 or 6% or per 100,000. This is just for this age group, right? So this 15.2 rate of 15.2, that's just for the age group 15 to 24 and same thing. So that's why those are two different numbers. So here you see homicide is a big leading cause of death, for younger people. I also want to draw your attention to the green, which is suicide, which unfortunately almost always, except for 15 to 24, is going to outpace homicide in terms of loss of life. So I just want to draw that to your attention. We don't cover suicide in this class for a lot of different reasons, but think back to your definition. It can be a form of violence. There's intent, there's an object, right? So it can be considered a form of violence. It's not one that's often talked about for a lot of different reasons, but I just want to throw that out there for you. So fun fact too about this unintentional injury category. I think I put it here for you too. It's harder to see. But I broke it down into what that would mean, unintentional injury. And there's a lot of different things on there. A lot of them are going to be traffic accidents. You can see MV, motor vehicle, traffic. This unintentional poisoning, though, that's going to include your opioid overdoses. And that is why it is at number one leading cause of death, for 25 to 64. And that's just unintentional poisoning altogether. But people aren't getting poisoned with a lot of things, really. It's mostly opioids. And if you scroll through here too, you can also see that there are, let's see if we can find one. Oh, so unintentional firearm, right? So that's a top 10 cause of the unintentional injury death, right? So those are different. It's not the sixth leading cause of death for those 5 through 9. It's the sixth leading cause in the accidental category. So just so you make that distinction, but it does make the cut. And we are going to talk about guns in here as well in this section. Okay, so homicide is the general term that we use for when one person kills another. It does not matter the reason. It does not matter the circumstance. It does not matter the profession. We talk about this in terms of when police justifiable down there, kill a person. Right, so homicide is anybody killing anybody else. And we break that down into 3 categories. And we're going to focus mostly on the third, a little bit on the second. All right, so we're going to go back to that. Okay, so the first one we have is excusable homicide. And this is, whoops, we killed somebody, but it was just kind of a freak accident. There's not a person that had intent. Remember, intent is in a lot of our definitions, to cause any harm to any individual. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the picture that I show over here or the case. I link you to the news clip here, but I should have refreshed my memory on this. This was a family that had vacationed out west. And if you travel out west, you know that there's a lot of wide open space. And one popular thing to do in these wide open spaces is to have shooting ranges for guns with larger travel, right? You have to account for where that bullet's going to end up. So you'll be able to shoot different kinds of guns a lot of times out west than you would at your traditional kind of like pull up into a building shooting range here. And so that's what's going on here. And this little girl, I believe she was 11, but don't quote me on that. Watch the news clip, it will tell you. Her parents brought her, they were all shooting with an instructor that you can see here, right? He's helping her, teaching her how to be safe, teaching her all of these things. And she's shooting and she's doing great. And this was a gun that you could flip into automatic mode, right? I don't know the terminology. I just know from reading about this. And when that happened, unfortunately, she kind of couldn't handle the kick to it. And she shot and kicked back at the exact moment that shot the instructor right up through the chin and killed him instantly. There was a lot of talk about this tragedy, right? Like, what do you do? There's no one really to blame. This little girl clearly didn't want to hurt the instructor, let alone kill him. She's already, that's probably traumatized enough, right? So there wasn't really a call for her to go to trial for murder, but people were very angry about, that was irresponsible of the parents, was the thing that you heard. And you're like, well, it's definitely not going to a movie theater, but it is legal and the place exists. The state licenses places like this and allows them to exist. So there's really nobody to point the finger at. There's nobody to blame for this man's death. And so this is my favorite example of an excusable homicide. She didn't mean to. Everything was legal. Everything was done correctly. It just happens. All right. Sad story. Justifiable homicide. I'm going to put up all this stuff here. Yeah, there we go. Is a little bit different. So you hear justifiable homicide for 2 main reasons. The first would be when a police officer justifiably shoots, and typically shoots, right? That's the main weapon that we use. Typically shoots and kills a person, suspect, arrestee, runner, person of interest, whatever that end term is. When that is found to be justifiable after an investigation, and to determine if charges should be brought or not, if policies were followed or not, that would be considered a justifiable homicide. So that's when you hear that term. You also hear it a lot more, specifically in the media, when it comes to self-defense or stand your ground laws. We're not going to spend too much time talking about stand your ground laws in here because this is, excuse me, not a criminal law class. But these became really polarized in the mainstream media when George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin in Florida. And I link you to that overview here. That law was like, you had all kinds of talking heads on TV. That's not what stand your ground is. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. But it really kind of brought into the social conversation this idea of, okay, well, when am I allowed to fight back versus when I'm not allowed to fight back? Should I back off? Right? Because that's the big thing with stand your ground laws. Essentially, it removes you hear duty to retreat, right? Let me put this up. Let's see if we can do this here. There we go. So this is the Ohio law that was passed a few years back. And Ohio used to have what we called the castle doctrine, where you were allowed to use justifiable force or deadly force, justifiably, if someone was threatening you, your family, another person, your home, or your property, right? But if you're standing in the middle of Fifth Avenue and somebody's kind of like coming at you and threatening you, you can run away, right? If you just pulled out a gun and shot and killed them, that would not fly under the castle doctrine because that's a public space where you both have the right to be. What the switch from the castle doctrine, colloquially known as, to stand your ground laws is essentially this. And this PDF is great. You can read the whole thing because it lines out the changes that were made to flip this from the castle doctrine to stand your ground. So you can see exactly what changes. And essentially, it's going to be this part right here. A trier of fact, and it's going to be a judge or a jury, shall not consider the possibility of retreat as a factor in determining whether or not a person who used force in self-defense, defense of another, or defense of that person's residence reasonably believed that force was necessary to prevent injury, loss, or risk of life or safety. And you can see here that person's residence is crossed out. All of this is crossed out. And added is if that person is in a place where the person lawfully has a right to be. Well, everybody has a right to lawfully be in the middle of Fifth Avenue, right? So it really kind of extended that right. Right's not the right word, but extended that ability to use lethal force outside your house or things that you were protecting of your own. Okay. And then I link you to the actual law here if you want to poke around in the legislature website, which is always a good time. All right. Now, a lot of states have what we would consider stand your ground laws, and essentially that means that ability to use lethal force in self-defense is extended to a public place. So you can see kind of where has this law and where it doesn't. They've become much more popular in the past 8 to 10 years, I would say, than they were before. You see states passing them at a higher rate. I link you here to some of the findings about stand your ground laws. Oh, I didn't really want to look at them. But okay. And these findings, always when you're looking at stuff like this, you always got to look at where it comes from. And this comes from RAND, which is like a research academic think tank. You're not going to find one that is dead center, nonpartisan, very unbiased. It just, to my knowledge, doesn't exist. If RAND had to lean a certain way, it would be to the left. Not all the way, right? But like about here. Probably your right, my left. But you get the idea. It leans a little bit to the left. But I like them because they are very, very, very transparent about their studies. They don't just say, here's what we found. They say, here's how we defined it. Here's the methods that we use to come to our conclusion. Here's this, here's that. And they show you every step of the way what they're looking at. And what they find is that stand your ground laws may actually increase violent crime. We talked about like death states with the death penalty, right? Having higher murder rates. This is kind of the same idea. Um, no qualifying studies showing that stand your ground law decreased any of the 8 outcomes we investigated, and then they tell you what those are. So I'll leave you to poke around that. But I just want you to know that that resource exists for you. All right. So when we break down our 3 types of homicide, we have excusable, justifiable, and now we're going to move into criminal. And here's where we get into murder. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the different types, different charges that we can do with murder. But here you can see premeditation, deliberation, more spontaneous. These are all things that came up in our discussions about how we're defining violence. Did you plan it? Was that your intention? Getting an Amazon delivery. So that really kind of plays into how we charge things. Sorry. If we don't want to go all the way to murder, we have manslaughter, and here's where your intent is kind of dwindling. Your purpose is kind of dwindling. That type of thing. Okay. Here's the fun part. All right. So when it comes to murders, and violence in general, by definition, they have to happen in a social situation, right? We've decided that you have to have an offender and you have to have a victim. So that's a social situation right there. Sorry, apparently it's a heavy package. For violence to happen, the meanings, your book says, the meanings people attach to their behavior is an important element in understanding what takes place in a given circumstance. So everyone is going to interpret things differently. You're in a crowded place and somebody kind of shoulder checks you a little bit. You might think, oh, they just bumped into me. Or you might think, asshole, what are they doing? Are they trying to start something with me? It depends on your perception. It depends on the context. It depends on like the vibe of the room. It depends on all of these other things. But violence has to start when you have a social interaction and somebody is going to perceive that violence is going to occur or already has occurred. So this means that the outcome of the encounter depends on the perceptions and the behaviors of actors involved. So I'm at a crowded concert. Somebody bumps into me and they're like, oh man, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get up here. Okay, no problem. Somebody bumps into me and I'm like, hey, what's wrong with you, right? Option B is going to be more likely to lead to violence than option A. And because of that, we can kind of see the pattern of behavior. And, when I was in college, I worked in a bar to pay for college. And it was a busy bar and it was a rowdy bar at night. And it was so interesting to me, the sociologist, right, to just kind of watch when the fights were going to happen. Like you could just tell. You could tell when people were getting drunk, and you could tell when people were getting angry, and you could tell when they were starting to challenge each other, and you're just like, oh, give it an hour, right? We're going to have an issue. And then we would have an issue because there was a distinct pattern that was followed. And you see this in like bar fights, there's a pattern. In domestic violence, there's a pattern. In gang violence, there's a pattern. Not so much in random violence, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it tends to be very patterned in nature. And so typically when it comes to homicides, before we talked about like respect, right? That's a big reason for a lot of violence and a lot of homicides specifically. And it comes from, one thing could be a character contest. Like you can't lose face in front of your family, your friends, your affiliates, your colleagues, whatever it is. People don't want to lose face. They want to show that they are respected and deserving of that respect. And when that's challenged, sometimes, unfortunately, it'll escalate to violence. So something happens, right? Whatever it is. We'll use my bar example. So somebody, sits down next to somebody's girlfriend at a bar. This is like a common occurrence, right? They start like chirping at each other. Um, and it's just verbal at this point, right? Maybe like moderately aggressive verbal back and forth, but it's escalating, right? And if it was just those three people, person, significant other person that came and sat next to the significant other that was unwelcome, it would be so much calmer and so much easier to manage. But you have people over here going, you gonna let them do that? Are you gonna let them take that? Are you gonna let them talk to you like that? Are you gonna let them da da da? And they're kind of like chirping in the background. Now you have, okay, well, now violence is expected in this situation. And then so that person is going to choose retaliation. Both people have to agree to the confrontation, though, typically. Um, oh, Letterkenny, I think is the name of the show. It's on Hulu. There's this really funny scene where it's like these two kind of rural Canadian farmers that are at the centerpiece of the show. These two kind of like city boy types kind of come in with no shirts, and they're like trying to get the other two to fight, who are just kind of like sitting there. They're like, come on, let's go. Come on, let's go. And the other two are just like, no, I'm good. I'm kind of just like, no, thank you. And then no violence happens because they're just not perceiving it as a threat, and they're not engaging with it at all in a way that the other two wouldn't just kind of, pounce. Anyway, so when this happens, violence is used to resolve the conflict is the term that your book uses. But when we're talking about homicide, I don't know. Conflict kind of escalates when you kill someone. So then you have the act of violence, and then you have the conclusion to violence. So it has to end at some point. And we'll talk about some examples where it takes a long time to end. But somebody either runs away, they're arrested, or they face consequences from the other people involved. So, but it's a pattern, and you can look for this pattern in, like I said, in gang violence, domestic violence, bar fights, any type of violent act that's going to end in a homicide, except for stranger violence, which we'll get to, typically follows a pattern similar to this. Excuse me. So when we're looking at who people kill, it's important, right? If we want to understand the offender, we have to understand who they're choosing to kill. Unfortunately, often people don't kill. I mean, all of it's unfortunate, right? I'm going to misspeak here. All of it's unfortunate, but even more unfortunately, people don't kill people they don't know. They tend to kill people with whom they have a relationship with. Often it's going to be a significant other, typically a female significant other. It could be a family member. People kill their siblings, their parents, their kids. All people are wild, right? We're going to kill family members, and we're going to kill peers and acquaintances. And all of these people have the ability to anger us, to challenge our character, right? But we're also around all of these people. So some of it's logistical. You're not around, you're around your group, your core kind of group mostly. Sometimes strangers, grocery store, traveling, things like that, but mostly you're around kind of your circle. Now, the number of significant others, family members, peers, and acquaintances that are being killed is fairly level. Where we see a little bit of a rise is the strangers. And most of that is due to mass shootings, right? As you can imagine. So now we're seeing mass shootings happen at concerts, schools, churches, all of these places where people might not have a direct relationship to the person. Sometimes they do, right? So if a school shooter is going into their school, maybe with a few specific targets in mind and then kind of collateral damage. But sometimes it's going to be strangers. I use the Las Vegas shooting as an example, a great example of that. The guy had no idea who was going to be at that concert, who he was going to hit from up in that hotel room. He just wanted to cause destruction, and he was pretty successful. All right, so when we come back, we will be talking about mass shooters. People say the term mass killing, mass shooting almost interchangeably, and we'll talk about why that is. But that will be our next section. And so we'll stop there. All right, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.